The spotlight was burning hot against Frank Sinatra's face when he saw him. Row 3, center seat. A young man in a wheelchair, maybe 25, with hollow eyes that Frank recognized from mirrors during his own dark nights. It was October 15th, 1954, at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. Frank was 3 songs into his midnight set, the room thick with cigarette smoke and the kind of electric energy that only happened when the right crowd found the right performer at the right moment. 2,000 people hanging on every note of "I've Got You Under My Skin," their faces glowing in the amber stage lights. But Frank's eyes kept drifting back to that wheelchair. The man sitting in it wasn't moving, wasn't swaying with the music like everyone else. He just sat there, perfectly still, staring at Frank with an intensity that cut through the crowded room like a searchlight. Frank had learned to read audiences the way sailors read weather. 20 years of performing had taught him to spot the drunk who'd caused trouble, the woman whose heart was breaking, the kid who'd never heard live music before. But this young man in the wheelchair was different. There was something in his stillness that made Frank's throat tighten. As Frank reached the bridge of the song, his voice carrying that familiar ache that made women cry and men remember their regrets, he found himself singing directly to the man in the wheelchair. The rest of the room seemed to fade away. It was just Frank Sinatra and this stranger who looked like he'd seen too much for someone so young. That's when Frank did something he'd never done before in 20 years of professional performing. He stopped singing mid-phrase. The band, confused, gradually stopped playing. 2,000 people fell silent, wondering what was happening. Frank set down his microphone and walked to the edge of the stage. The spotlight operator, uncertain, kept the light trained on him as he crouched down, bringing himself to eye level with the man in the wheelchair. "What's your name, son?" Frank asked, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. The young man looked surprised that Frank was speaking to him. "Jimmy," he said quietly. "Jimmy Kowalski. Jimmy, I was watching you during that song. You looked like you were somewhere else, somewhere far from here." Jimmy's eyes filled with something that looked like recognition. "Yes, sir. I was thinking about before." "Before what?" "Before Normandy." The room was so quiet Frank could hear the air conditioning humming. He stayed crouched at the edge of the stage, this famous man in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, talking to a wounded soldier like they were old friends. "How old are you, Jimmy?" 24. Frank felt something twist in his chest. 24. Just a kid, really. A kid who'd given his legs to a war and come home to a world that had moved on without him. "You know what, Jimmy? That song I was singing, it reminds me of something too. Reminds me of being young and thinking I knew what love was. But I think you might understand it better than I do." Jimmy looked confused. "How's that, Mr. Sinatra?" Frank stood up and addressed the entire room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet Jimmy Kowalski. Jimmy fought at Normandy. He gave more for this country than most of us ever will." The applause was immediate and thunderous, but Frank held up his hand for quiet. "Jimmy, I want to ask you something. Is there a song you'd like to hear? Something that takes you back to before?" Jimmy thought for a moment, his face working through emotions that were too big for words. Finally, he spoke so quietly that Frank had to lean down to hear him. "My Way," Jimmy whispered. "But not because of what people think, because when I was lying in that field hospital, trying to figure out if I wanted to keep fighting to live, I kept thinking about how I was going to do things my way when I got home, even if I had to do them sitting down." Frank felt his eyes burn. He walked back to the microphone, looked at his band, and nodded. But instead of launching into the song, Frank began to talk. "You know, I've sung that song 1,000 times. It's about being proud of the choices you've made, about standing by what you believe in. But I think Jimmy here understands it in a way I never have." Frank's voice grew stronger, more personal than his audience had ever heard it. "See, it's one thing to sing about doing things your way when you've got all your options. It's another thing entirely to make that choice when half your options have been taken away, when you've got to rebuild everything from nothing, when you've got to find a new way to be the man you want to be." The room was completely silent now. Even the bartenders had stopped pouring drinks. Frank looked directly at Jimmy. "This one's for you, son, and for everyone else who's had to find a new way to do things their way." What followed was the most emotionally charged performance of Frank Sinatra's career. He sang My Way not as a celebration of success, but as a prayer for resilience. Every line carried the weight of understanding what it meant to survive when survival seemed impossible. When he reached the final verse, Frank did something unprecedented. He gestured for Jimmy to join him. Two security guards immediately moved to help Jimmy onto the stage, wheelchair and all. Frank handed Jimmy a second microphone, and together they sang the final lines. I did it my way. Jimmy's voice was untrained, shaky with emotion, but it blended with Frank's in a way that created something neither man could have achieved alone. 2,000 people were on their feet, many of them crying, witnessing something that felt less like entertainment and more like communion. After the song ended, Frank kept Jimmy on stage for the rest of the set. They talked between songs, Frank sharing stories about his own struggles with depression and self-doubt, Jimmy talking about the friends he'd lost and the future he was still figuring out how to build. You know what I learned tonight? Frank said to the audience as the evening wound down. I learned that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing what you need to do anyway. Jimmy here has more courage in his little finger than I've got in my whole body. After the show, Frank spent 2 hours with Jimmy in his dressing room. They talked about music, about the war, about what it meant to start over when everything familiar had been taken away. Mr. Sinatra, Jimmy said as the evening ended, I came here tonight thinking about ending things. I've been thinking about it for months, but listening to you sing, talking with you, I remembered something. What's that, son? I remembered that I've still got a voice. Maybe not for singing, but for something. And maybe that's enough to build a life on. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. I want you to call this number tomorrow. A friend of mine runs a radio station here in Vegas. He's always looking for people who understand music, who can really talk to an audience. You interested? Jimmy stared at the card like it was made of gold. You really think I could do something like that? Jimmy, you've already done the hardest thing anyone can do. You've survived. Everything else is just details. 6 months later, Jimmy Kowalski was the most popular radio DJ in Las Vegas, known for his late-night show, where he played music for everyone who's fighting their own war. He never mentioned his disability on the air, but somehow people knew. His voice carried the weight of someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and find the strength to begin again. Frank never forgot that night at the Sands. He started ending every Vegas show by dedicating a song to all the Jimmy Kowalskis out there, doing it their way. He never explained what he meant, but the people who'd been there that October night understood. Years later, when reporters asked Frank about his most memorable performance, he always talked about the night he stopped mid-song to talk to a stranger in a wheelchair. That night taught me something important, Frank would say. The spotlight doesn't make you a star. How you use it does. The last time Frank saw Jimmy was in 1972 at another Vegas show. Jimmy was in the audience again, but this time he was walking. He'd met a woman who loved his voice on the radio, married her, and had 2 kids. After the show, they embraced like old friends. You saved my life that night, Jimmy told him. Frank shook his head. No, son, you saved mine. You reminded me what music is supposed to be about. What's that? Connection. Finding the other people who understand what it's like to be human. That night in 1954, Frank Sinatra learned that sometimes the most important audience is just one person. Sometimes the most powerful performance happens when you stop performing and start being present. Sometimes the spotlight isn't meant to shine on you. It's meant to help you see who needs the light most. The music matters. But the moment when the music stops and 2 human beings recognize each other across all their differences, that's when magic happens. That's when a song becomes something more than entertainment. It becomes medicine for wounds that nobody else can see.